Welcome, my friends, to a night of terror. As the cold winter winds whisper through the trees and your hearts beat a little faster, I invite you to listen closely to 3 tales of things that should not be, from unsettling sounds that haunt the quietest places, then through the dark, jagged mountains where no man dares tread. Finally, we uncover faces that are better left unseen. Keep your wits about you. There may be things among us tonight, things not entirely from this world, but do not fear, for it is far too late for that now. Clara had always found a strange comfort in the isolation of winter nights. The world outside her modest home was swallowed by a howling blizzard, the wind's mournful wail, and the swirling flurries composing a haunting symphony of desolation. Inside, however, the silence was punctuated not only by the rhythmic ticking of an old wall clock, but also by an unsettling feeling that seeped from the very walls of her home. That evening, as the storm battered the eaves and rattled the window panes, Clara settled into her favorite armchair with a well-worn book. The soft glow of a table lamp and the steady crackle of the fireplace had long been her sanctuary. Yet as the hours passed, and the tempest outside grew ever more insistent, she began to notice an unfamiliar sound, an intermittent, shuffling noise that did not belong to the natural chorus of the storm. At first, she dismissed it as the creaks and groans of an old house settling under winter's weight. But the sound grew persistent, a quiet rustling that skittered just at the edge of her consciousness. Unable to shake her disquiet, Clara rose from her chair and wandered through the dim corridors of her home. The noise was elusive, its source hidden in the oppressive darkness. She paused in the living room, straining to listen. The sound was neither the howl of the wind nor the patter of rain against the window. It was something else, something closer, something that seemed to breathe from behind the walls themselves. No matter where she turned, the noise remained just out of reach, a spectral murmur that stirred her anxiety with every uncertain step. After a while, as she made her way down the narrow hallway toward the laundry room, a space long neglected, Clara felt a cold prickle at the nape of her neck. The sound now took on a low, resonant quality, like a desperate whisper riding on a draft. With each step, her heart pounded faster until she reached the laundry area. There, a rusted metal grill concealed an old chute used long ago to dispatch linens into a dark, forgotten space behind the walls. An inexplicable dread welled up inside her as the faint murmur emanating from the chute grew more insistent. Trembling, Clara knelt beside the chute. For a long, agonizing moment she hesitated, every instinct urging her to retreat to the safety of the light. But a morbid curiosity, mingled with a rising terror, compelled her to lift the small cover and peer inside. In that split second of dim, flickering illumination, her eyes met a sight that would forever haunt her memory. At the bottom of the chute, pressed against the encroaching darkness, was the disfigured face of a man. His features were grotesquely twisted in a silent, agonized grimace, and his skin hung loose over a gaunt, sunken skull. In the gloom, his milky, unseeing eyes fixed on her with an intensity that chilled her blood. A frozen scream seized in her throat. For what felt like an eternity, Clara sat paralyzed by horror, her mind struggling to comprehend the impossible. The face in the chute was no trick of light or a byproduct of the storm's distortions. It was a real, living, if horribly deformed, remnant of a presence that had found its way into her sanctuary. The quiet rustling that had haunted her all evening now made dreadful sense, each sound echoing from that dark, hidden passage. Just as she began to stagger back, Trying to convince herself that the vision was a cruel illusion, a new sound reached her ears, a different, more deliberate noise. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible over the howling wind, but unmistakably human. Footsteps, slow and measured, coming from upstairs. A chill beyond the natural cold crawled along her spine as the sound grew steadily louder. The creak of wood underfoot, the occasional scrape against the floor, all converged into a haunting cadence that seemed to echo through the very bones of the house. Clara's mind raced. Had the face in the chute been the work of some ghastly accident? Or was it a sentinel, an omen of a far darker presence? Now, with those deliberate steps approaching from above, she realized she was not alone. Every rational thought urged her to flee, yet terror rooted her to the spot. The oppressive silence that had followed the revelation was now being punctuated by the relentless, foreboding approach of someone or something coming up the stairs. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she inched toward the door, each creak of the floorboards overhead amplifying her dread. The sound of the footsteps was slow, almost reluctant, as if the intruder were savoring every moment of the impending confrontation. In the dim light, cast by the flickering hallway bulb, Clara's eyes darted to the banister, her mind scrambling for an escape route. But the corridor was empty, save for the spectral echoes of that unsettling tread. As the steps drew nearer, Clara's pulse thundered in her ears. Her trembling hand reached for the phone on a nearby table, but before she could call out or press a button, the sound halted abruptly. A silence so complete, it was as if the world had stopped spinning. For a few agonizing seconds, the house held its breath. Then, without warning, a single footstep resounded right at the top of the staircase, followed by the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open. In that moment, Clara's terror crystallized into a stark, paralyzing certainty. The horror that lurked in the chute was not an isolated incident. Something, or someone, was in her home, moving with purpose through its shadowed corridors. The realization cut through her like ice, and she sank to the floor beside the laundry chute, every nerve aflame with dread. The footsteps were now mere moments away, their measured cadence a grim countdown. Clara's heart pounded as she strained to listen for any sound that might give away the intruder's intentions. A rustle of fabric, the clink of metal, but the oppressive silence swallowed every hint of life. Outside, the blizzard raged on, indifferent to the human terror unfolding within these walls. In that suffocating darkness, with the disfigured face still burning in her mind's eye, and the approaching footsteps heralding an imminent confrontation, Clara faced a horrifying truth. On this bitter winter night, in the isolation of her own home, the boundary between the known and the inexplicable had been shattered. The presence that had lurked in the forgotten depths of the laundry chute had only been the first symptom of an unfathomable invasion, a sign that some horrors are not confined to the shadows, but can climb the stairs and step into the light. And as the final footstep echoed ominously closer, Clara could only brace herself for what was to come, her soul trembling at the thought that the true nightmare had only just begun. On a bitter winter night, when the rain fell with an unyielding, relentless fury, and the wind carried with it the chill of distant, unspoken sorrows, Sarah found herself alone on a deserted highway after a grueling 10-hour drive to reach her son's home. A journey fraught with solitude and the weight of longing. She spotted, in the distance, the weary glow of a roadside rest area. Desperation mingled with relief as she pulled over, seeking refuge from the storm and a brief respite from her exhaustion. The rest area, a dilapidated building bathed in the weak luminescence of a sputtering street lamp, looked abandoned even in the harshest of storms. Sarah, in dire need of a moment's privacy, ventured inside. The corridors echoed with the sound of dripping water and the quiet murmur of age-old neglect. She soon found herself before the entrance to the women's restroom, a small, unassuming door promising a temporary escape from her solitude. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of damp decay and stale memories. Sarah entered a cramped stall, its walls marked by years of disuse, and locked the door behind her. For a fleeting moment, the normalcy of a routine visit provided solace, even as the low, flickering bulb overhead cast shifting shadows that danced like silent ghosts. But as she sat there, the fragile peace was shattered by the unmistakable sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps echoing just beyond the door of the women's restroom. At first, the sound was almost imperceptible, a measured thud of work boots on cold tile, accompanied by a ragged, labored breathing that seeped into the silence. Sarah's heart pounded as she strained to comprehend what was unfolding outside her small sanctuary. She heard the door open. Through the narrow gap in the stall door, she caught a glimpse of a tall, dark silhouette, a man whose long, unkempt beard and imposing stature were illuminated only in fleeting moments by the unstable light. His presence was not immediately malevolent in intent, yet it carried a weight of dread that defied explanation. Then the man slowly walked over to her stall and stopped. She could see the work boots from under the stall. He turned to face the stall door, his boots pointing toward her. She could see the top of his head over the stall, bald with stringy hair. She was paralyzed with fear as the man just stood there, breathing. After a few minutes, the man turned and walked out of the restroom. Sarah was terrified, and only after a few minutes of being frozen in horror, she gathered herself and cautiously walked out of the women's restroom and headed to the parking lot. There was no sign of the man who came in the women's restroom. Outside, the rain assaulted her again, the cold droplets mingling with her rising panic. In the bleak expanse of the parking lot, amid the scattered puddles and dim shadows, a sudden shout pierced the night. "Hey!" The voice was raw, urgent, a sound that jolted Sarah into a state of heightened alarm. In the chaos of her escape, she had scarcely processed this new intrusion, her mind still reeling from the terror within the restroom. She began to run toward her car, the desperate cadence of her footsteps echoing off the empty lot. The voice continued, insistent and pleading, chasing after her. At that moment, Sarah assumed the worst, that another threat had emerged in that accursed place. Her thoughts were clouded by the storm of fear as she fumbled with her keys, the man's cry swallowed by the din of the relentless rain. Only later, as the car's engine roared to life and she began to drive away, did the full extent of her nightmare reveal itself. In the fragile, trembling light of the dashboard, Sarah's gaze was drawn to the rearview mirror. There, in a reflection as chilling as any ghost story, stood the same dark, spectral figure, the tall, bearded man whose presence had haunted the restroom. The sight was a final, dreadful confirmation. The horror had followed her, having somehow gained entry into the back seat of her car. It was only in the desperate, heart-stopping seconds that followed, when the terror of her predicament coalesced into a single, unbearable truth, that the role of the man chasing her became clear. His frantic shouts, echoing across the rain-soaked lot, had not been the harbinger of another threat, but rather a final noble attempt to warn her. In that frantic cry lay the desperate message: The very same interloper, that spectral figure who had invaded the sanctity of the restroom, had now taken refuge in her car's back seat. He had run after her not as a pursuer, but as a reluctant messenger, a witness compelled by the instinct to save a life from a horror too unfathomable to articulate. Alas, by the time Sarah recognized the grim truth, it was far too late. The spectral presence advanced with an inexorable silence, a dark inevitability that no speed or desperate plea could repel. In the final moments of her frantic escape, as the headlights dimmed and the engine's roar gave way to a haunting stillness, Sarah's terrified cry was swallowed by the storm, a solitary sound marking the end of her struggle against an unseen, unstoppable terror. Thus, in the aftermath of that ill-fated night, the truth emerged in fragments, a truth born on the lips of the lone man whose desperate warning had been lost in the tempest. His actions, a final bid to alert a doomed soul, echoed through the empty corridors of that desolate parking lot. And so, Sarah's tragic fate became a somber reminder that on the long, lonely roads of winter, where shadows merge with the night and unseen terrors lie in wait, even a cry of warning may come too late to forestall the inexorable pull of the darkness. Ben had always craved solitude, a chance to escape the cacophony of everyday life and lose himself in the vast, untamed wilds of America. So when he found a weekend getaway deep in the Bob Marshall wilderness of Montana, he seized the opportunity. With a hot tent, a trusty old shotgun, and a heart set on recharging amidst nature's raw beauty, he set off for a camping trip that would test the limits of his endurance and courage. Ben arrived at a remote clearing, tucked away in the dense forest, where towering pines and rugged rock formations stood as silent sentinels. The fading light of day gave way to a deep, velvety dusk as he unloaded his gear from his weathered pickup truck. With practiced ease, he set up his hot tent, a sturdy shelter designed to keep him warm, even in the harshest winter nights. A small propane heater hummed quietly inside, and he arranged his supplies with a calm determination that masked a lingering trace of apprehension. He had planned for every eventuality, or so he believed. That evening, as the first gusts of a fierce Montana blizzard began to lash at the clearing, Ben sat by a small portable stove, stirring a cup of hot coffee. The wind outside roared like a wild beast, its mournful cry mingling with the whisper of snowflakes cascading from the sky. For a time, the isolation was comforting, and the timeless rhythms of nature lulled him into a sense of quiet contentment. As darkness deepened, Ben crawled into his tent, drawing the thick fabric around him as a barrier against the cold. The heater's steady warmth provided a fragile bubble of comfort amidst the icy world outside. Yet even as he began to drift off to sleep, he became acutely aware of a strange sound, a low, almost rhythmic rustling that didn't match the howling wind. At first he dismissed it as the old tent shifting in the gusts, or perhaps a small animal scurrying outside. But the noise grew persistent, echoing through the quiet night. Unable to quell the creeping unease, Ben sat up and unzipped the tent door. Gripping his flashlight, he stepped outside into the biting cold. The beam of light danced over the snow-covered ground and dense stands of fir, yet revealed nothing out of the ordinary. The forest was silent, save for the wind. Shaking his head, Ben returned to his makeshift shelter, the strange sound lingering at the edge of his awareness, a subtle reminder that not all was as peaceful as it seemed. Dawn broke slowly the next morning, the horizon painted with a ghostly palette of pale blues and grays. Ben emerged from his tent, his breath forming misty clouds in the frigid air. The world was transformed by the storm, every surface blanketed in a thick, unyielding layer of snow. He spent the day gathering firewood and reinforcing his tent's perimeter, all the while keeping one eye on the forest. Despite the previous night's eerie incident, the day unfolded with an unsettling calm, as though nature itself were holding its breath. As dusk approached once more, the weight of the wilderness pressed upon him. With the storm returning in earnest, Ben resolved to settle in for another night inside his hot tent. He double-checked his gear, ensuring his shotgun was within reach, and retreated into the relative safety of his small, insulated world. The second night was markedly different. The wind's howl was now joined by a series of soft, deliberate sounds. At first, Ben thought it was merely the storm intensifying, but as he lay in his sleeping bag, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on the frozen ground reached his ears. They were not the random, chaotic sounds of nature, but measured, almost purposeful steps circling the perimeter of his tent. Ben's pulse quickened. He unfastened his zipper just enough to peer through the thin fabric. Outside, under the pale glow of his portable lantern, he saw unsettling shapes moving in the periphery of his vision. They were humanoid, yet not quite human. Shadows, hunched and distorted, drifted close to the tent. In the feeble light, he could discern that their movements were odd. Each step was marked by a peculiar, dragging motion as their gnarled hands scraped along the frozen ground. Gripping his shotgun tightly, Ben forced himself to remain calm. His mind raced with possibilities, yet each one was more implausible than the last. Were they wild animals, or perhaps deranged locals lurking in the wild? As he strained his eyes against the darkness, he could now clearly see two distinct figures, their forms twisted and hunched. Their faces were obscured by the shadows, but their unnatural gait, the dragging of hands, the shuffling, the jerky, uncoordinated movements, was enough to send a chill through his veins. Ben raised his flashlight and swept the beam across the clearing. The light revealed more of their eerie silhouettes, gaunt, with limbs that bent at awkward angles, as if nature had deliberately marred them. The figures moved slowly, as if testing the boundaries of their own existence, and then, without a word or a sound, they retreated into the dark, enveloping forest. For a long, heart-stopping minute, silence fell. Then a guttural moan, almost imperceptible, broke the quiet, a sound that seemed to emanate from deep within the creatures. Ben's instincts roared to life. He pressed his back against the tent's side, his eyes darting around for any additional movement, while his hand remained fixed on the cold metal of his shotgun. Suddenly, one of the figures approached again. This time, the creature came perilously close to the tent. In the dim light, Ben saw a flash of something, an eye, or perhaps a glint of something metallic. Before the figure's hand brushed against the tent's exterior, the creature's touch was unnervingly gentle for something so grotesque. Then, as if emboldened by some dark instinct, it began to circle the tent with deliberate purpose. Ben's mind raced. Every scenario he had ever imagined in isolation, every campfire ghost story he'd laughed off in the past, surged into focus. He tightened his grip on the shotgun, ready to defend his life. As the creature's heavy footstep came closer, a burst of adrenaline surged through him. With his flashlight beam trembling in his hand, he prepared for what felt like an inevitable confrontation. In the ensuing chaos, the creature lunged. Ben fired his shotgun, the blast echoing like a gunshot in the dead of night. The sound shattered the fragile silence, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. The creature staggered, a low moan escaping its twisted lips. Yet the reprieve was brief. In the melee that followed, as the creature scrambled back toward the darkness, Ben felt a searing pain in his side, a sharp, burning sensation as if a jagged claw had raked his flesh. Gritting his teeth against the pain, Ben fired another shot, and this time, the creature let out a final, guttural cry before it retreated fully into the black forest. The remaining figure, which had remained hidden in the periphery, vanished as well, leaving behind only the eerie echo of its movements in the cold night. Ben sat in his tent long after the sounds had faded, his heart still pounding like a war drum. The pain in his side was intense, a vivid reminder of the encounter. But he was alive. In the quiet aftermath, as the blizzard began to subside and the first hints of dawn crept over the horizon, he gingerly inspected his wound. With trembling fingers, he realized that the injury was more than a mere scratch. It was a deep gash that would require stitches. Yet amidst the shock and lingering terror, a surge of determination took hold. He had survived the night, and he would live to tell the tale, scarred both in body and in spirit. In the pale light of morning, Ben gathered his gear with a resolute heart. The encounter had shaken him to his core, but it had also awakened a newfound respect for the secrets held by the wilderness. He knew that the grotesque figures he'd encountered were not mere legends, but real, horrifying remnants of a world that existed at the fringe of civilization. With a slow, painful limp, he made his way back to his truck, the evidence of that terrible night, a permanent reminder etched into his memory and his skin. As he drove away from the remote clearing, the vast, silent expanse of the martial wilderness receded into the distance, a stark, unyielding reminder that even in the heart of nature's beauty, unspeakable horrors could lurk in the shadows. Ben's weekend had not ended in the way he had ever imagined, but his survival was a testament to the fragile resilience of the human spirit, even when faced with the most grotesque and primal terrors lurking in the wild.